President Trump is downplaying concerns from military families worried about conditions on board the USS Abraham Lincoln. The aircraft carrier had its deployment extended earlier this year to support the war with Iran. Its sailors have now been at sea for more than 250 days and more than 200 days without a port call, breaking a record. Families have raised concerns about the serious mental toll the deployment is taking on the crew. And CNN has learned a sailor jumped from the ship earlier this month. The Navy says the USS George Washington carrier group is heading to the Middle East to relieve the Lincoln. Joining us now, Democratic Congressman Chris Deluzio, a Navy veteran and a member of the House Armed Services Committee. And Congressman, I want us to first listen again to what we heard from the president when he was boarding Air Force One this afternoon.
Family members of U.S. service members are concerned about the conditions on board the USS Lincoln.
Well, no, that ship is moving. No, they're not. That ship is moving right now, or very shortly, and it's being replaced with another very similar ship.
Has the deployment gone on too long? Are you worried
No. Not nearly long enough.
Congressman, what's your reaction to the president's words there?
You know, when Donald Trump's term to serve in Vietnam came, he dodged the draft. And for him to tell the families of those service members who've spent more days at sea than any American sailors in modern history is just a disgrace. He should go and say that to the faces, right to the faces of the family members, and see what they have to say about that. It's such disrespect for sailors and Marines under his command. He's the commander in chief, and he is responsible ultimately for the conditions of the captains that he puts in command of the carrier strike group that's affecting these sailors and Marines. That is his responsibility, and he should take some accountability. It's disgraceful stuff.
You've been at sea with the Navy, so you understand the lifestyle. Have you had conversations with your fellow Navy veterans across the aisle about what Congress needs to do and can do right now?
Well, we're out of session away from Washington. The Republican leadership sent us out some weeks ago. But I think the Armed Services Committee should get to the bottom of this. I've been part of efforts to get answers about the treatment of personnel aboard the Lincoln. This should not be a partisan fight. Republicans should join us. I don't care if that's getting the secretary in front of us or getting a congressional delegation on the carrier to find out what's happening. Families are sharing reports of what's gone on with offices like mine and offices all over the country. They are saying clearly that their loved ones, their sailors and Marines, are not being treated well, are pushed to the brink. And remember, they've been at sea now for months and months. They went more than 200 days without a port visit. That is horrible for any sailor in any condition, yet these are folks supporting combat operations, accepting and launching aircraft, doing all the things that you would do in tough environments. It's really, really brutal on these sailors and Marines.
How many families have you heard from, Congressman, and what specifically are they telling you?
Look, I want to respect the confidentiality of those conversations because my sense, and there's been reporting of this, is that there is fear of reprisal for their service members. So I'm going to respect that confidentiality. But there have been plenty of reports of family members reaching out to offices like mine, talking about the conditions, talking about food, lack of mail, how tired and stressed out their sailors are. And again, if you were just, deployed at sea, out to sea for a month, that'd be a long time because you're on watch, you're doing your job. Ships work 24/7. When you put on top of that combat operations and going 200 days without a port visit, you see the problem, you see the stress these folks are under. It's really unacceptable. We got to get to the bottom of what's gone on to our sailors and Marines.
Now is the father of a U.S. service member who is serving on the USS Abraham Lincoln. First of all, a huge thank you to them for their service and to your family for your sacrifice. I know this can be hard on families too. So when we spoke before this, you described your child as, quote, proud of what they're doing out there, while simultaneously saying, they're ready to come home. Tell us, how are they doing and how are you doing with the deployment?
Well, all of us parents miss our children very much, and I know we're all very proud of them. As far as my particular child, I've heard pretty positive feedback about the conditions there. Although I noticed the sailor saying the work is repetitive, that is something that we hear a lot. And we understand that they're under a lot of mental stress and have nothing but sympathy and respect for the hardships and the stress that are inherent to the operation that they're conducting right now.
Yeah, and I think what you said is important because, as I've been noting, it's not a monolith, right? You've got around 5,000 people on board that ship, and it's going to wear and tear on some people more than other people. You said you've heard positive feedback. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you've heard from your child?
Well, in some circumstances, they form friendships, they form camaraderie. Yes, food quality apparently has gone up and down, and I understand that that's to be expected when you're in a combat situation. I think there's a realization of the enormity of the operation they're conducting, and I think that really got driven home when they got deployed. And so, as they have time to digest that and go through the day-to-day work, I think it's created some appreciations of the people around them and forming those human connections, and also, once again, the enormity of the world around.
I wonder what you think about this deployment being extended. It was supposed to be done in May. It's been extended several times. Has that been an issue for your child, and has it been hard on you? Do you think the Navy was fully prepared in the way it should have been here?
Well, I mean, obviously, I want them to come home, and all of us as parents have some questions about the length of time that it's taken and the distribution of military assets. Obviously, I cannot speak to that because I don't know anything about it, but we would love to see a situation where relief can come in a timely fashion and sailors can have rest and relief and put their feet on the ground and go on land and see a little bit of the world. So that's been concerning, yes. Just
not having that sort of the port visits, right, that are expected. That's what I keep hearing from sailors I'm speaking to and family members. Just there hasn't been the lengthy port visits or the frequency of port visits that you would typically get on deployment. Are you hearing that sentiment?
Absolutely. And I do know that must be very essential for mental health and for morale.
Yeah. I'm wondering, a U.S. official tells me that last month a sailor on the USS Abraham Lincoln went overboard. Actually, it was earlier this month. And that sailor was wearing a life vest. It was seen as a mental health incident, kind of a cry for help. We don't know the exact circumstances of everything around this, but I wonder what your reaction is as a father when you heard that, and also these attempted man overboard events that has been reported by the Military Times.
Well, it's obviously terrifying, and because they're in a combat zone, communication is not regular. So you always wonder, every one of those sailors, and I didn't realize this, they kind of become like your own child. You think of them as a group, they survive as a group, and they work as a group, and you're concerned about every one of them, and we care about them. And so that is grieving to hear that people were pushed to that limit mentally. And I think it makes us want to take a hard look at how this generation of sailors is being prepared. As time goes on, generations change, and perhaps we need to reanalyze how we're training or preparing them or the timeline for deploying them.
You have a unique perspective because of your past profession. You worked with the younger generation. Tell us more about that concern. And do you feel like your daughter was properly trained for a deployment like this?
Well, as far as my child, I don't know. They have the most formidable intelligence and strength of character and will that I've ever seen. I've taught high school for 27 years, so seen a lot of different kinds of children, but this one in particular, I know is strong. This generation, particularly, we're pursuing different areas of education with them. We're strengthening them in different ways, and we're educating them in different ways. And I really feel that perhaps there need to be conversations after these sailors come home, and we welcome them, and we're all very proud of them, but there need to be conversations. And I'm sure that honestly, the military is probably engaging in those right now.
Has your child expressed any feelings of mental health strain? And do you know if your child feels that there are adequate resources to address that? I'm wondering if you could give any more of an insight into that.
I've had very positive communications, but I do know the boredom, the heat that's been out there, and I can't imagine the humidity. It has taken its toll. I question about the supplies at the beginning, and we're hearing these reports, and this is the first time we're ever hearing these reports. And then it's hard to know what's true, what's exaggerated, and it's very worrisome, I will say, on the parents' end, because you hear these things even if you know they're not true or they might be grossly exaggerated. It is an extra amount of stress when your loved ones are at sea and you worry about them because yes, they're in a combat zone. But as far as my particular child, rations got a little rough for a while, and I know conditions can be a little rough. I've never been on a carrier, and they have, so I can't speak to that, but I got to say they're keeping their chin up on this one.
Yeah. Well, again, your child and all those sailors on board, I got to witness it firsthand, just the incredible work that they're doing and the sacrifices they're making. And they are being pushed to the limits here. And like I said, there's really a spectrum in terms of how sailors are being impacted right now with this lengthier deployment. I'm wondering if you were able to sit down with the Naval Secretary or the Defense Secretary, what would you ask them? What would you want to hear from them in this moment?
Wow, that would be an interesting conversation for sure. And I do also thank you for your reporting you did on that ship. I was very happy to see that there were reporters out there last month and did some just excellent stories. And thank you for that.
Thank you.
If I were to sit down, there would be conversations about defense dollars and about infrastructure. You know, our military has always been noted for its infrastructure and its supply lines because it's very easy to put assets in places. It's very hard to keep them there. And I understand that. I just kind of want to know, are we really, really investing in that infrastructure, in that supply line, in those allies, in those harbors and ports and safe places for our ships to go and to get resupplied and to get some R&R? And I don't know how that's going, and I don't hear too many people speak to that. It's the supply chain. It's not the asset itself.
Yeah. As I have been reporting, I'm told by a U.S. official that the USS George Washington is en route. It is expected to relieve the Abraham Lincoln. Things can change. They have before, but that's the expectation. Once your child and the other sailors come back on land, what do you want people to do? How do you want them to be embraced?
Those are our country's sons and daughters and wives and husbands and mothers and everyone you can imagine on these ships. And I really, truly hope that when they come home, that they're welcomed so strongly. No one really expected this to happen. And I know that my child's greatest fear was absolute boredom and nothing happening. And I know no one got that on this tour. That was not what happened at all. So we need to welcome them home and realize that they're our countrymen first, and they need love and support. And they've been through a lot of stress that will change them forever. So let's see some welcoming home and some love and care, because we do love them.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. And thank you again for all the sacrifices you and your child are making on behalf of this country. We appreciate it.
Secretary, thank you as always for being with us. First, I just want to get your reaction to President Trump saying that this record-long deployment, more than 250 days, has not gone nearly long enough.
Well, I interpret what he meant was it not long enough in terms of the conflict and putting pressure on the Iranians, certainly not with regard to the ship. We know that the ship has been gone continuously now for, 260 days or so, and has chalked up the longest voyage without a port call. And of course, the Gerald Ford before her in the same region did the same. So I think what you're seeing are the stresses being put on the United States Navy and on the sailors themselves as they continue to support the blockade and ongoing combat operations in the Persian Gulf.
Do you read the situation on the Lincoln as a result, perhaps, of a lack of foresight or planning by the Trump administration Because the president predicted this conflict would only go 4 to 6 weeks. It's been over 5 months.
I see this first and foremost, Boris, as a Navy issue, as a service issue. It begins with the captain of the ship and works its way down to the non-commissioned officers. And during my time on active duty in the Army, when I deployed for the Gulf War, all the way through my time as Secretary of the Army and Secretary of Defense, this is something we always paid attention to, was morale of the force and the health and welfare of individual soldiers or sailors. So it begins there. I think, look, the reports that of not getting fresh fruit and poor food and mail being disrupted and things like that, those are command issues that tracks its way back to the Navy. So if I were in the job again, I would be asking the Navy leadership, the Secretary of the Navy and the Chief of Naval Operations, to come to my office and tell me what's really going on. Why wasn't this ship being serviced? Because oftentimes, and during my time, ships get extended. You don't want to do that because it is hard on the sailors, it's hard on the families, and frankly, it's hard on readiness, both short-term and long-term. But to me, it begins at the service level with doing the basics in terms of managing the health and welfare and ultimately the readiness of the ships.
Talk to us about managing that health and welfare perspective of these service members. It obviously has caused a great deal of mental strain, whether because of a lack of resources on board or just physically being away from home for so long, for an undetermined amount of time, an open window of time that the Lincoln was going to be out there. How does someone on board the ship manage all of that?
Look, it's demanding. I obviously never served in the Navy. I was a soldier, but I have done brief stints, a day or so, 2 days on a carrier. They are very cramped quarters. It's a nonstop work, very physical labor, in very confined areas. Sometimes, depending on where you sleep, it's tough because there's ongoing aircraft operations all night long. And so it's a very demanding job, and you're at sea, you're not seeing land. You may not have a port call in this case. And look, I understand they were doing combat patrols. Maybe, again, they maybe couldn't have done a port call. But for them not to get mail, to not have fresh food, there's no reason for that. There's no excuse. That's a logistical failure. And my view would be there should be some type of inquiry, at least as a start, to determine, what happened. Is there truth to these reports? Because some are contesting the validity of these reports. But do an inquiry to find out what's going on. Call the Navy leadership in, find exactly what's happening, and kind of take charge of the situation to find out what's going on. If it's happening with one ship, it may be happening with others as well. And Lord knows we have, a dozen or so destroyers deployed. We have other support ships. And you got to make sure you can sustain the force, sustain readiness, and you do that at the lowest level possible, beginning with taking care of your service members.
And what you just said leads me to my next question, Secretary, because more broadly, the rate of U.S. shipbuilding has been reduced over the last few years. The U.S. has fewer aircraft carriers today than it did during the Gulf War. That means a smaller fleet carrying a much bigger burden. Why did this happen? How does this change potentially?
Yeah, it goes all the way back to the end of the Cold War when we reduced the military by about 40% or so. We reduced, aircraft carriers, as you said, from 15 to about 11. We slowed shipbuilding in a number of areas. During my tenure as Secretary of Defense, I took this on personally, meeting with industry, talking to the Navy, came up with my own shipbuilding plan in terms of modernizing the fleet with a combination of legacy ships like carriers and destroyers with autonomous vessels, both surface and subsurface. But nonetheless, we still have had challenges. It begins in the building, in terms of contracting requirements, extends to Congress with regard to how money is appropriated. Industry has its own challenges with workers. Simple things like getting welders into the force in terms of building these ships are challenging. When you layer on top of that, Boris, the fact that maintenance has kept too many ships in dry dock for too long, it's just a compounding problem. In fact, I'm doing a think tank commission right now with the Atlantic Council trying to figure this out and make recommendations to the United States Navy. It is a long-term problem, particularly one that we have to overcome quickly, because when you look at the Chinese, who surpassed us in 2017 or so, 2016, by having the largest navy in the world, we know that their shipbuilding is 230 times our capacity. Wow. And so we continue to fall behind. Yes, I'm glad to see that the president and this administration is putting more emphasis on shipbuilding. I think it needs a lot more of attention, but we have to catch up. And if you can fix shipbuilding, at the same time, you have to fix ship maintenance. And when you do that and grow the fleet, then you can reduce the impact. You can reduce the amount of time sailors are at sea ships are being deployed, and you can reduce the burden on the force and actually improve readiness over the long run. It costs money, it takes time, but it's worth it because we're now in this era of great power competition where we're going to have to face off against the Chinese, certainly the Russians, and other navies that are out there.
Former Defense Secretary Mark Esper, we have to leave the conversation there. Appreciate your point of view. Thanks for joining us.